Hello everyone, my name is Rochelle Innocent and I'm the founder and CEO of Project Purpose. Welcome to our YouTube channel. We are a community that is focused on fostering the intellectual and character development in children. We do this through our parent-child workshops that focus on 4 themes: autonomy, self-efficacy, compassion, and self-concept, in order to cultivate grit, perseverance, and resilience in each child. Project Purpose's overarching mandate is to renew and rebuild families, communities, and relationships. Our YouTube platform provides us with an opportunity to discuss all topics that relate to families, communities, and relationships with ourselves as well as with others, with a primary focus on mental health and education. More precisely, the ways that the structures of mental health and education have played a role and are currently playing a role in our societies at large. Our discussions provide us an opportunity to think critically about what needs to change within the structures of mental health and education in order for us to live up to our bold slogan: support, protect, and empower each child through youth-focused development, better known as leadership in juvenescence. With that said, as is the YouTube convention, please do subscribe, hit that post notification bell so that you're aware of every time we post. And of course, if you like the conversations and if you want to keep these conversations going, please do like, comment, and share this video. Let's get into it. Welcome back. I hope that everyone had a great weekend and that this week is panning out exactly as anticipated for all of you. Last week we had a discussion on mental wellness and we talked a little bit about how resolutions and having goals provide focus and clarity in order for you to be very mindful about where you put your energy and be very intentional about who and what you're putting your energy into. This week we're pivoting. Project Purpose is focused on having discussions and lively debates on topics that relate to mental health and education. And these 2 tiers have many different subtopics within them, but when we talk about mental health, that also branches off into mental wellness, because mental health is an industry and there are practices within the industry that we want to uncover in order to have conversations that change and move the dial on how these industries support us in the future. And with education, it's very multifaceted. So I want to talk about education because I think that we need to all be on board with the changes that need to happen in the sphere of education in order for our children to thrive and in order for our children to feel supported, feel protected, and feel empowered. And unfortunately, I don't think that our education systems do enough to sort of foster that kind of environment. When I started this channel, I started out with some foundational videos to give you a bird's eye view of my opinions on what needed to change within each of the specific spheres. As it relates to education, I think that more needs to be said about the foundations of modern day education and of compulsory schooling. I think we all need to have the same baseline in order to be able to engage thoughtfully about how the education spheres have become detrimental to our children's development. And I think that to be future focused about the way the education needs to evolve, we really need to understand the roots. We need to understand the history of education, and nothing happens in a vacuum. Education was a byproduct of the social and political environment of the time. And while I never enjoyed history growing up, I thought it was very dry and horribly boring. As an adult, I've developed an appreciation for history, and that appreciation has been nourished by being able to access perspectives and different points of view on our collective history. And unfortunately, the most boring and stripped down historical point of view is the one taught in our school curriculums. And that's unfortunate because I think we don't do ourselves any service by being ignorant of what took place and what sacrifices took place, what battles were fought for us to be in the position that we are in now. And I say us very mindfully. All of us are experiencing a certain degree of privilege, a certain degree of freedom, a certain degree of access because of battles fought before us. And I think when it comes to modern day education, a lot of us have forgotten some of what those battles are and some of what the context behind why modern educational institutions were built up. I want to talk about the foundation of compulsory schooling in a two-part series so that we can level set there on after. And I promise not all of what I'm going to talk about in relation to education is going to be historically based, but I do think that we all need to have the same baseline before continuing on the conversations moving ahead. And as I mentioned in my foundational videos, these are definitely my opinions, but they're founded, so they're well informed. I'm going to provide some of the majority of the resources that I've leveraged in order to provide us with this space to have this discourse and this conversation. And of course, please do disagree with me. If there's something that I'm saying that you disagree with, I would love to hear from you. I would love for you to share your point of view in the comments. This is really a forum where I want us to have critical debates. I want to hear everyone's points of view. I want everyone's points of view to feel heard. And let's talk about it. Let's hash it out so that we can create something that is a collective of all of our consciousness that works to the betterment of our children moving forward. And I think the only way we can do that is if we have those conversations that are a little prickly, and if we have conversations where we're not all in accordance. And I want to create a safe space for those conversations to take place. So when we think about education and some of how we define it, I'd love for you to take a moment and just think about what education means to you. And I want you to think about that, because a lot of the time when we think about education, there are different subjects that we learn. There are different, platforms or forums that we might engage in, but all of us sort of anticipate that if we're sending our children to school, they're becoming literate. If we're sending our children to school, they're becoming well-versed with all the tools that they need to be successful in life. So before modern day schooling, before mass schooling, education was about the intellectual and character development of children. And education was also something that was only provided to those of status and of privilege. So those people would have private tutors, those people would have different individuals who were experts within different topics who would help them cultivate an understanding and an appreciation for different topics, and also build a critical thinking lens. So it's not just learning a topic to then, regurgitate information in relation to that topic. It's really engaging with topics. So thinking about those topics, developing your own point of view on those topics, delving deep into all the different perspectives that one can take on that topic before cultivating your own. And this critical thinking lens part of learning has very much been diluted. And in fact, I think even for me, I only learned how to think critically and how to develop my own position with the information presented in front of me in my introduction to logic class. And taking logic classes and having philosophy as a big core element of my cognitive neuroscience degree, I learned how little I knew about how to think about the topics in front of me. And this was after having spent my entire life in the school system. And I say school system, but I've had a bit of an eclectic schooling experience. I was homeschooled for a period. I went to public school. I did a little tiny stint in private school as well. So I've been exposed to different educational environments. And yet still, by the time I made it to university, it was in university, and only perhaps specifically because I took philosophy, that I understood how to think about information being presented in front of me. And there was another course called the Practices of Looking. And Practices of Looking is really thinking critically about the images, about the messages that are presented in front of you, and cultivating a sense of what is motivating whoever is behind the scenes creating that message and sending it to you. Having a sense of, what's the ulterior motive here, and unpacking messages, unpacking visual imagery, so that you're not always falling prey to those messages and kind of caving in and being manipulated by what's put in front of you. You're always actively interacting and engaging with that information. And this is really the core elements of intellectual and character development, having the capacity to create your own position and to defend that position. And that's a skill, that's a tool that not enough people who've been through primary, secondary, and sometimes even undergraduate education have access to. They can do the tasks and the requirements of the role, but they haven't necessarily been given the sort of lens to actively engage with everything presented in front of them. It's like you present it, they take it in, and they regurgitate it out, but there's no real engagement there. So we talk about education before mass education. Education was really about fueling the capacity to think critically, fostering deep thinking, sort of embracing and nourishing the desire to think and cultivate your own position and your own attitudes about, what's happening in society, what's happening in politics, and different topics that lend to us being capable and informed citizens within our respective countries, within our respective communities, so on and so forth. Now, when education became compulsory, when it became a mass education sort of agenda about education and how it translates today, and education and how it translated prior to mass education, there's a huge disparity in the goals and motivations of education. The motivations of education prior to mass education was really about fostering a critical thinking lens and cultivating that intellectual and character development so that everyone had their own position and had the language to articulate those positions between one another. And then the cool revolution happened. And again, education doesn't happen in a vacuum, but mass education is a byproduct of the cool revolution. Why is that? Revolution was progress for some, but not everyone. And this is interesting because when we learn about the cool revolution in school, there's so many details that are diluted and that are sort of brushed under the rug. And what we need to recognize is with the cool revolution became sort of this idea of work without meaning. The cool revolution provided an environment where there was work to be done, money to be gained, without a whole lot of meaning behind it. So a lot of people who were working on farms were self-sufficient and had, a traditional family dynamic, who were really truly living what we call today the American dream, creating their own stamp in the world, were sort of pulled into the opportunities that were available in the cool revolution. And those opportunities completely shifted and changed the values and the traditions of that day. So being self-sustaining was an opportunity to kind of do the work you needed to do and find meaning within that work, whereas the coal revolution didn't require you to find meaning in the work at all. And in fact, now there's this third party who only is thinking about productivity, who's only thinking about the bottom line and of margin. And at that point, we didn't have rules and regulations to protect people from being exploited. So you had people during the coal revolution, you had people being horribly abused, horribly exploited, working long hours in the mines, having, injuries, horrific injuries, and being fired for those injuries. There were horrible working conditions for adults and children alike. I mean, it wasn't progress, and it was progress by way of economic growth, but that economic growth came at a cost, and that cost was human lives. And when we say human lives, I'm not just talking about deaths. I'm talking about the quality of life and our attitudes towards what the standard quality of life that each person should have completely shifted and changed. It changed. And, people were working 12-hour days. People were working in mines. People were having mines collapse on them, like horrific working conditions. And they would put children in those mines as well. There's a complete exploitation of units of production that happen to be human beings. Okay? And I think this is important to talk about because it is out of this environment that mass schooling came to fruition. And mass schooling became a byproduct of children born out of broken homes, and those homes were broken by the environments of work that were built out of the coal revolution. And I'm not a historian. All of this is information I've learned, and I want to share with all of you because I think it's important that we understand that Mass schooling wasn't a byproduct of a few people who had altruistic motivations. Let's talk a little bit about the impact, the social impact of the coal revolution and how that plays into mass schooling. So let's say the population of Britain between 1651 and 1800, just before the coal revolution, it grew by roughly 15%. During the coal revolution, it grew 13 times faster. The population of Germany during the coal revolution grew by 300%. And the population of the Americas grew by 1,700%. So think about those are astronomical numbers. So this coal revolution, while it created mass opportunities and it created an opportunity to make wealth, a lot of people were exploited. They didn't make wealth, but they were the reason why other people had the capacity to make wealth. So these are the people who were working in mines, who were working, in factories, working in horrific working conditions. They were being injured, they were being killed, they were being poisoned, they suffered from addictions. And even now, if we look at present day, some of the conditions and some of the behaviors that stem out of working in mines and working in some of these industries, there's still a lot of socio-economic issues around these specific industries, but at least there's government regulation now. There was not government regulation then. The requirements to be successful within these industries broke families. It broke families apart completely. Families everyone was at work, whether you were elderly or very young. Even children were set into the coal mines and made to fit in different tunnels because they had small little hands. And a lot of children were exposed to disease. A lot of children were diseased as a result of these work conditions, and it was horrific. And I also want us to think about the populations that were in these coal mines, right? The first few waves of immigration into North America were, Italian families, Jewish families, Irish families. Families came to North America in order to kind of participate in this North American dream during the coal revolution. And there was a lot of struggle, there was a lot of sacrifice, and there was a lot of exploitation. The things that we're learning about today, about what happens in factories and sweatshops in third world countries, these are the things that were happening in the Americas, in Germany, and in Britain during the coal revolution, right? And these are what we would call, horrific work conditions. There was crimes against humanity taking place. And, these working conditions, the hours of labor, the exposure to harm, whether that's chemical exposure or whether that's physical harm, and then no liability on the company's part. If you were hurt, they fired you. If you were sick, they fired you. There is no protection of the employee. And this was all what brought about the critical mass and the need for unionization because of the mass amounts of exploitation that took place. But let's take a step back and think about how this impacted families. This had a negative impact on families. Families were being torn apart, if not for the fact that, parents no longer had the capacity to work because they were injured or because they were ill. So, this sent families into mass poverty, or there were addictions that took place because of the work environment. Name the scenario, it took place during this time, and this largely broke families all across the North, all across Americas, all across Britain, all across, Germany. The coal revolution, while it was great for economic growth, it was one of the key factors that destroyed familial values and destroyed the healthy dynamic that existed within families. It began to be torn apart. Mass schooling was the response in order to tame and train children who were uprooted and who were also the byproduct of broken families from mining and from factory work, because mining and factory work destroyed families. So education before the coal revolution was really only accessible to those with privilege, right? And those children had the opportunity to build a critical thinking lens, to think critically about the world around them. They were philosophical in the way that they engaged and interacted with information around them. They knew how to think about all that lent into being an informed citizen. Now, when education became not only available to everyone, but compulsory, recognize that the objectives changed. The objectives were to take children that everyone knew were from broken families, right? So government recognized, these children are being raised in broken families. These families were broken by, the conditions of factory and mining work. We still need, based on the projected growth, we need these populations to be equipped to take over once their parents are no longer sort of available to work. The way to do that is through mass education, which is why when we think about some of the traditions and some of the norms in education systems, a lot of it was priming and conditioning for the kind of menial work that was expected in a mining environment or in a factory environment. You do work, the bell rings, you stop the work. But even now we recognize that the literacy abilities of our children are going down, right? And that's because education is continuously failing to provide that intellectual and character development, provide the opportunity to think critically about the world around them. And now they're even failing at the basics, which is like the ability to, leverage arithmetic, reading, and writing as a way of engaging not only with their immediate community, but with the global community. The Coal Revolution, education was reserved for the privileged and the elite of society. Post-Coal Revolution, education was really about priming and conditioning the population for factory and mining work, because that was the future. The future was factory and mining work, and they needed to make sure that they had a funnel of children, became adults who had the capacity to work on the production line. And I think that it's important that we recognize that these were the objectives and these were the motivations, because we see now the disparity between how we define education and how education was objectively defined by those who've implemented it and made it compulsory. That disparity still exists today. The only difference is today we no longer require blue-collared labor. We no longer require that many, units of production in factories or even in mines, because we have automation and robotization. We have technologies that are now replacing what used to be human units of labor. So what do you do with the people now who have been primed to work on a production line that no longer requires individuals? And I think that that's why we as a community need to be part of how we co-create education moving forward, because the education that we've all been subjected to was not built for the intellectual and character development of each of us, right? It wasn't built for that. It was built to prime us and to condition us to continue on the load that our parents carried, a load that broke families, that broke communities, and that created a lot of dissension and division as well. And this is all for capitalistic gain. So when we think about, this was a boom, the Industrial Revolution was a boom, the Coal Revolution was a boom, for some but not others. And I think we need to recognize that, and we need to be mindful, now that we're in the digital revolution, of the socio and political dynamics that are going to be created out of this revolution, and that we need to, on our own, decide how we ensure our children are equipped to thrive their own way. We're not going to offload that decision on people who only are looking at margin and only looking at profit, and treating people as units of production. I think that the age of treating people as units of production, I think we can stop that moving forward. I think the digital revolution provides us with an opportunity to allow people to pivot back towards meaning and to find work that gives them meaning and to find work that gives them a sense of purpose. And we can break away from this schema of I'm only valued as much as the skills that I've cultivated for a vocation, for a profession, for a trade. That should not be the way we look at why we send our children to be educated and why we send our children to be trained moving forward. If I were to summarize all of what I've said, my bone to pick with education was meant to be the Band-Aid that temporarily fixed a lot of the effects of families that were broken by working conditions of a few generations before us. And this wasn't that long ago. And it was supposed to be a Band-Aid, but it was also meant to continue on extracting people as units of production to feed into mining and feed into factory labor, despite the fact that those who were sort of watching the dynamics as a result of this revolution saw how it was destroying families. And that is a history. That is a point in history that is not highlighted enough, if at all. And that is something that we all have within us to change. We have that within us to change. And it's interesting because history is no longer history in education, it's social studies, and it's very diluted. It's very, skim on the surface. You learn about history nowadays, unless you're doing your own learning, unless you have access to, museums, exhibitions, documentaries, learning outside of, the core curriculum provided by modern day education, you often lose sight of the pain, the sacrifice, and the struggle that took place in history for each of us to live the life that we live. And for us to co-create an environment in the future, we need to recognize all of us came from some degree of pain, struggle, and sacrifice. And we need to sort of, in my opinion, honor that pain, struggle, and sacrifice in the way that we build and create a future world that is not a reflection of the past. We've evolved. We can do something different and something better, and we can be more evolved in the way that we treat people and reintroduce people to our humanity. If we are a byproduct of, capitalism maximizing on our time and sort of stripping us down to units of production, if all of us are a byproduct of that history, and that history involves, people who were permanently disabled as a byproduct of work, people who have contracted diseases as a byproduct of the working conditions or the environments or the chemicals and products that they were exposed to, people who come from broken homes, who come from abusive homes, as a byproduct of these institutions not taking into consideration the humanity of those involved with progress, then that is something that needs to weigh on our conscience as we think about how we engage with the institutions and think about how we want to earn an income and build our societies and our economies moving forward, ensuring that our humanity is kept intact, because it was not for the generations that came before us. So this is part one, and it's a somber topic, I'll admit. It's a somber topic, but I think North American history, Canada and United States alike, it is a history that is sombering. It is a sombering history. We currently are sort of in this space where there's lots of pain being unearthed and a lot of discussions being had around, the history of slavery, the history, the racial division, and a lot of the socio-political dynamics that are a byproduct of that. But it's deeper than that as well. I think it's not a black and white issue. It's not an us versus them issue. The American, Canada, and the United States alike, the history is built on this concept of human beings being reduced to units of production, like stripping people of their humanity and seeing them as sort of entities that have the capacity to create margin. And now that we're moving more towards automation and robotization, we have artificial intelligence, and we have robot intelligence, and we can now use machines to do what people did. But when people did it, we treated people as machines, and that broke our humanity, and that broke our communities, and that broke our relationships, and that broke our families. We need to put our families, our relationships, our communities back together. And as part of how we co-create and recreate our future, we need to make sure that the institutions that we build and that we surround ourselves with are those that are motivated by the preservation of each of our humanity, of meaning that we derive from the work that we do, and provide all of us the ability to achieve and tap into our potential and our purpose. So this is part one. I'm not really sure how long this video is, and it's part one because I do want to get into the metrics. I mean, I spoke high level about families being destroyed, but I want to go into more detail. I want to provide you more facts and figures to further bring my point home, because I think that it would be a mistake to think about how we recreate and co-create education without recognizing that education, mass education, compulsory schooling, was a byproduct of the world of work that was built around the coal revolution. The way that people were treated as units of production within the coal revolution, and how that informed the way that our education systems and our curriculums were built. If we want to rebuild our education systems and our curriculums, we need to build them with a world of work that is best suited to preserve our humanity in mind, so that the education systems that we build preserve our children's humanity and put the focus back on the intellectual and character development. That's all that I wanted to say for today's session. I would love to hear your point of view. I would love for us to, get into the debates, get talking, and I really hope that you agree with me when I say that we can't think about education in a silo. We need to think about all the socio-political sort of interactions across one society that informs the way that we value education and we choose to educate, the future generations to come. And I hope that all of us can think about the ways that can shift and that can evolve as we think about what education will look like for our generation and future generations to come. Anyways, until next time, thank you so much for tuning in.
I just feel like no one's listening.